Manufacturing Matters is an MFG Radio Network production brought to you by GIE Media's Manufacturing Group as industry experts take deep dives into the latest manufacturing matters, whether it's new innovations, products, technologies, and emerging markets that help you understand better why manufacturing matters to you and also to the top companies in the medical, aerospace, defense, and electric vehicle manufacturing industries.
Hello, and welcome to Medtech Development from Concept to Market, brought to you by GIE Media Group's manufacturing publications and by Archetype Medtech Limited. I'm Eric Brothers, editor for GIE Media's manufacturing group. Currently, 3/4 of Medtech innovations fail to make it to market. Archetype's Dr. Stuart Grant, principal consultant and Medtech visionary, will discuss how a comprehensive suite of services embeds market approval into the DNA of the Medtech product design innovation process. Learn why integrating market approval into every stage of product development is necessary to streamline the concept to market process for successful product launches and to get life-saving medical devices into the hands of surgeons and patients faster and more efficiently. Stuart holds a Bachelor of Science honors degree. That's an undergraduate degree that offers a deeper, more specialized and academically rigorous study of a single science subject compared to a standard Bachelor of Science degree in product design. He holds a Master of Science degree in product management from the University of Wisconsin and a Doctor of Philosophy or PhD in technology and innovation management. He's a chartered engineer of the Institute of Mechanical Engineers, as well as founder and principal consultant of Archetype Medtech. Renowned for his role as a fixer, challenger, and change maker, highlights of Stuart's 25-year career include spearheading groundbreaking initiatives at DePuy Synthes and Johnson & Johnson Medtech. An inventor and tinkerer at heart, Stuart is the named inventor on multiple patents for market-leading medical devices. Before we begin, we'd like to thank the series sponsor, Kennametal. Kennametal has been cutting metal since 1938. It's a story of continuous innovation, starting with the development of revolutionary tungsten titanium carbide alloy cutting tools specifically for working with steel. This not only led to a new class of machining tools that cut faster, lasted longer, and drove productivity in everything from the automobile to the airplane, but also to Kennametal's recognition as an industry leader across continents and industries including transportation, construction, aerospace and defense, medical, general engineering, and more. As they say at Kennametal, we don't cut corners, we cut metal. Your toughest materials don't stand a chance. Learn more at www.kennametal.com. Welcome, Dr. Stuart Grant.
Thank you, Eric, for the introduction. Really appreciate that. Firstly, welcome everyone joining the WebEx today. I'm really happy to share some of my knowledge that I've gained over the many years working in medtech. I started my career back in 2000 when I graduated, and so I've been doing it 25 years, and mostly orthopedics, some surgical, and a bit of robotics. I've had the opportunity to work, as you can tell by my accent, I'm from the UK, so I worked in the UK. I moved over to the US and I worked in Warsaw, Indiana, which is where all the orthopedic companies are, for 7 years, and then after that I worked in China, and I lived and worked in China for 5 years developing medical devices for emerging markets, what we called them at the time then, but it was mostly products for China and India, helping them make products that are sort of based on the designs we've done over here in the West, but sort of modify them for those specific market needs. I've been back in the UK for the last 8 years, and one of my main projects when I came back was leading the Joint Recon MDR program, so bringing all the legacy products through MDR, making sure they're all compliant and getting that CE declaration of conformity. At this point in my career, I've now innovation management consultant in Archetype. And what we do, we help clinicians, typically clinicians or salespeople, bring their ideas to market. So typically come with a proof of concept that they've either sketched up or 3D modeled or done some electronics together, and then working out how to get it to market. And what Archetype we do is we look at the complexity of that, work out the classification, and then we build the innovation plan around that design. And that includes design, engineering, you'll typically find on an NPD project. We bring all those subject matter experts together in a virtual team, and we guide that product through the process to get to market approval. So as we are a company of full-time employees, we're always adapting to that complexity of that medical device. I see I've got 16 people on. It'd be interesting at this point if you go into the Q&A box and type in what country you're calling from, and what your function is. So are you in R&D, engineering, design, testing? Are you commercial, sales, or RA, QA? Can go on. Medical affairs, packaging, labeling. It'd be really interesting to see what the audience, where you're coming from. So when I'm talking through the slides, I can sort of modify it a little bit to address your particular functions. So firstly, I'm going to go through the slides, but feel free to, as Eric said, to drop any questions into the question box. So there's two, you'll notice at the bottom. I just saw somebody drop something in. You've got a chat box and you've got a Q&A box. Make sure you use the Q&A box, because I won't be able to see the chat box. So today, let's just go through the agenda. I'm going to talk about starting with the end in mind, right? What we're trying to achieve in medtech, firstly. Then we're going to move on to market approval and your innovation strategy, how you're going to get to that end point. Talk about QMS and regulatory, and then move on to design and development, and finally touch on some of the clinical health economics and reimbursement. These are big questions, right? Each one of these, to go in detail, would take a day's worth of training. So I've just got one or two slides on each one, but they are quickly go deeper and deeper and deeper. But we've only got about 40 minutes, so I can just give you a reasonable overview of the medtech product innovation process. Minimally invasive surgery and respiratory devices. Hi, Matthew. Tom, located in the US. Great, thank you. All right. So first of all, let's have a look at market approval and your innovation strategy. Really, what does that mean? So when we think about getting to our product to market, we've really got to think about what that approval process is. So we hear a lot of, you've got to go and talk to your regulatory and quality people. As an engineer, we'll sometimes feel a bit like, oh, do we have to? Can we leave it to the end? But it's really important when you're beginning the innovation journey to understand what your regulatory and quality requirements are for the countries you're going to launch in. And I'll get onto this in a bit, but those regulatory and quality requirements change all the time as well. They're constantly evolving. So you always have to be adaptable when you're developing your product. So when you design when I say an innovation process, this is all the activities you have to go through to get it to market from where you are today. Let's say you've got a proof of concept, it's working, you've got the sort of basic engineering working, but you've got to do that refinement of the design, do the detail engineering, do the testing, manufacturing, all those aspects have to be done to get to approval. So as Eric said, a lot of medtech startups fail before commercialization. And this is many, many reasons for this. It's multifaceted. You can't just put your finger on one, but it sometimes is because we don't know what we need to do, and we don't know the unknowns. So there's a lot of risk as we're going through the innovation process. And as startups, finances is limited, as we know, and the journey is long, with full of lots and lots of problems that as I've said here, the valley of death. You run out of cash before you get to the point where you can actually start making some money. And that is the worst thing, because you've invested a lot of time, effort, your own money, brain power into it, in getting to a certain point and just hitting another risk, another fall, sometimes is really disastrous. And what I try to do is, hopefully the startups that I work with, is try to avoid that as much as we can, so we can go as fast as we can and retain as much money as we can. And one of the real dangers or risks around this is market regulatory clearance. So how long is that going to take? When are we going to actually submit in Europe to the notified body, let's say? So, or the FDA, if it's a 510K or PMA, when we can submit, when we can get that clearance or an approval. So really got to think about, number one, obviously the engineering is the number one thing. If the product doesn't work, it doesn't matter if you've got approval or not. If it doesn't do a very good job of what it's meant to be doing, it's probably going to fail anyway. But on top of that foundation is how we're going to get that approved, how we're going to get it into the market. But one thing you've got to be aware of is these two words: market approval and market access. So market approval is the compliance part. That is a government body like the FDA, or here in the UK, MHRA, or the EU MDR, or a notified body, giving you clearance or approval that you can commercialize that device in their country, in their jurisdiction. It doesn't mean you can actually get anyone to buy it. That's market access. That is going through the procurement process, getting your coding set up if it's in the US, so it can actually be coded and be reimbursed to whoever's using it. So these are two different things. Market access is more about the commercialization activities. Market approval is about the engineering, the design, the compliance, the quality management systems, the regulatory aspects. So really, as a startup, you're probably really focused on the engineering. As you know, I come from an engineering background. I was a designer, and I was an engineer and a project manager in the PMO, developing products all through my life. So the engineering side is what I'm really passionate about, but we've always got to remember that there's the regulatory and the clinical aspects that have to be always built in. And these affect the engineering of the device. Simple things like what materials you choose. There could be a better engineering material for your problem out there that you could use, but if it's not a medical, basically, if it's not a medical device approved material, you're not going to get anywhere, or you're going to spend a lot of time trying to get the material approved for use, and it might not be the core value add of that product, that type of material. Or it might have a substance in that material that's approved, but takes a lot longer to get approval for. Let's say a material of animal origin, or a restricted substance like cobalt in a stainless steel or cobalt chrome. They will go for a slower approval process. And as an engineer, you've got to think to yourself, okay, I really want to use this material, but I know it's going to probably add 6 months onto my approval process. Is there an alternative, simpler material I could pick for generation 1? And maybe in generation 2, I can change the material out. Those sort of engineering compromises, shall we call them, have to always be made to keep this approval process in mind as you go through the process. All right, so that was a quick run through of market approval and how that relates to your innovation and design process. That's what I mean about keeping it top of mind, is how do we successfully navigate the approval process and do the engineering at the same time, because you can produce a beautifully engineered product that does exactly, meets all the unmet needs. But if it's not going to get approved by the government body because they are a clear stakeholder, it's a tricky situation. You might have to go back and redesign everything to make it for approval. So that's what, keeping that top of mind is really important. So first of all, the building blocks of medical device regulations. And in this world, there's probably two things you've got to be clear of. ISO 13485, which is the QMS, medical device QMS standard for the majority of the world. And then you've got the US, I put QMSR here, which at the moment is just QMS, but in February 26, the QMS is going to align to 13485. The US FDA is going to rename it the US QMSR, and it's going to be aligned to 13485. So, for example, the term design control that we're probably very familiar with is going to disappear. The US is going to adopt design and development, which is in ISO 13485. As this is only 4 months away, it's probably pretty pertinent that everybody needs to start looking at ISO 13485 and get compliance to that instead of looking at the current US QMS standard. When you're looking at this standard, you've always got also, if you're a startup and if you're doing a Gen 1, you've got to think about what size of QMS you really need to get through the process. Because you could build a massive QMS, like companies like Johnson & Johnson, Medtronic, Boston Scientific, they have huge QMSs with lots and lots of procedures because they're big companies that sell a lot of products and have high risk. As a startup, you want to sort of right size your QMS to what the product you're actually developing, especially that Gen 1 product. And there's lots of options out there for you. You can either do an electronic QMS like Greenlight Guru. There's PTC have Arena. Siemens has Windshield. There's probably like 20 or 30 different QMSs out there. But you need to think about what am I trying to achieve? And I was speaking to an entrepreneur the other week. They decided to do their QMS in SharePoint and have all their documents signed in Adobe sign-off, which is absolutely fine. That's an auditable process. It's all controlled. They got through the Valley of Death and actually have been selling their first gen for 2 or 3 years, and now are wanting to create another product, and have realized that going back into those dumb documents that are PDFs, all that data is just locked in a PDF, is not very desirable for them anymore, because they're now implementing an EQMS system, which is, I think they're actually using Greenlight Guru, and they've got to spend the next 2 or 3 months putting all that data back into the EQMS so it's really usable for the next generation. And this is a bit of a catch-22 here, because if they weren't successful enough to do a second generation, they could have spent a lot of money on an EQMS system that they never actually used because they went bankrupt. But because they've made it through that process and have started making a lot of money, now they're thinking, actually, we do need an EQMS. So not sure what the right answer to that one is, depending on how much money you've got in your bank. So as you know, people who are, if you're not familiar with ISO 13485, I encourage you to get a copy and read that word by word. As like every standard, they're pretty boring, but you've got to know this back to front, especially if you're going to get audited on your QMS system. You need to know ISO 13485. And that section 7 is the design and development section, is the really important point for a startup when you're developing the product. There's other sections about post-market surveillance, management controls, etc., etc. But please have a read of that and understand it, because that's how you'll build your QMS system. And I'll just add to that, actually. So a lot of quality consultants and regulatory consultants and probably product development consultants already have QMS systems out the box. So if you're a startup, I wouldn't encourage you to start writing procedures from scratch to meet ISO 13485. You can go and find a quality or regulatory consultant who can give you this as a pack of documents ready to go. And some of the EQMS systems, you can just install it and it's there, already audited, ready to go. It might have a big price tag, but it's a lot easier. You're not as a startup designing a medical device, it's not your job to develop a QMS system. People have done it before. I encourage you to just go and buy one off the shelf and modify it a little bit to your particular company and product. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about the EU. Just having a look at the, so there's a couple of US people, so you might be interested in the EU. So you're probably aware of the medical device regulation, MDR, that came into force in 2019, and all the companies have been trying to comply to it. It's the one critical regulation. And once you've got that, it allows you to sign your declaration of conformity that gives you the CE mark on the product that allows you access to all of the EU countries, including the UK, which you're probably aware is no longer an EU country. It also allows you access to other countries as well, like Canada, Australia, New Zealand, Japan, I think India as well, and some South American countries, because they see your product having the CE mark as a stamp of approval, and then the registration and approvals in those subsequent countries is a lot quicker. One thing you need to do if you're going to launch in the EU is contact a notified body. And this is where the EU and the FDA differ. So the FDA is obviously a US government department that reviews and approves all the medical devices in the US. In Europe, we have the EU, but then let's say they subcontract it to private companies. And these private companies are called notified bodies. And here's on the left of the slide here is all the notified bodies in the EU, and there's probably a lot more. There's probably about 30 to 40 notified bodies now across the EU that you can find in the EU website. And you as a startup, you go to the notified body and you contract that notified body to be your approval notified body and be your auditor. A bit like the analogy is in finance where you got Deloitte or KPMG. Who else? Arthur Andersen, not them. So this is a similar situation in EU. Accenture, that's what they're called now. So you submit to your notified body, they review your file, and if they're happy with it when you've gone through the process, the process is quite complicated, but it's quite well structured now. After the last 6 years of going through MDR, these notified bodies got a very good structure of how to do it, and the timelines are coming down significantly. It was 24 months, I think 3 or 4 years ago to go through certification. Now I'm hearing between 6 and 12 months, significantly shorter, because they've learned as well how to do the audits. Companies have learned how to do the audits. It's that knowledge is starting to get embedded into the industry. One thing about notified, because there's many to choose from, and you can choose whichever one you want in the EU, you need to choose wisely. And you need to treat, when you contract these people, because you pay them a lot of money, to do a class 3 review could cost you anywhere between 150,000 euros to 300,000 euros, maybe €500,000. So it's a big cost to the business. So you need to make sure you contract the right one. And this is like a job interview. You need to go and talk to these people, understand what they can do, what they can pass, what their capacity is, so how quickly they can review and give you answers back. Their experience in your actual medical device is really important. and that relates to scope. So each notified body will have a scope of medical devices they are allowed to audit. And you need to double check that one. Any testimonials from other startups or bigger companies, how they've worked with these notified bodies, and don't necessarily think TUV or BSI or GMED or DECRA are the big guns and probably the best ones to go to. As a small startup, you might always be at the bottom of the list to get questions answered. Maybe going to the smaller ones who are maybe a little bit more responsive might be the right answer for you. But not knowing what type of medical devices you're developing or what stage you're in, I can only give you sort of general advice. So please check their scope, what they actually do, and interview them and see how well they're going to respond. It's like any company you're going to work with. Make sure you work with the right accountant, the right lawyer, and the right notified body, and make your business go a lot quicker. So one of the key aspects to this is at the early point is device classification. And this will drive your whole innovation process. This sort of dictates how complex the process is going to be and what classification you're going to have, either 1, 2A, 2B, or 3, typically. And where that falls is like instruments in the EU is class 1s and 2As, implants are 2Bs and 3, and it's all based on risk. And the FDA has 1, 2, 3, which are instruments are class 1. One of the complexities at the moment is software as a medical device and AI and where those classes fit in. That's still a big discussion ongoing between the notified bodies, the EU, the FDA. We're all trying to figure out what's the risk profile of these devices. And they're typically going more conservative, so going to a higher classification because they're not sure yet, which is fair. And this last bullet point is just a watch out. Sometimes I've worked with companies who are trying to debate to get a lower classification. So maybe an instrument go from class 2A to 1 or 1R or 1S, and spending a lot of time thinking that's the thing that's going to make them go faster. It's not necessarily true, because if you look at the requirements sometimes across the different classes, they don't change that much. 2A, 2B, and 3 all need notified body certification unless it's a well-established technology, a WET. But as you're a startup developing something that's new to the world, I doubt you're going to have a well-established technology. So you always have to go through your notified body submission. So it may not be that important, but that's where a regulatory consultant or like myself, an innovation consultant, can help you craft that approach. Okay, so those are the building blocks, QMS and your regulatory strategy. Think about them as soon as you've got your proof of concept. You know what your clinical need is, you know what you're going to try and address, and you know roughly how you're going to try to address that. Either a mechanical solution, electromechanical solution, a software solution, all these different engineering solutions change the way, obviously, the innovation strategy will be affected. So moving on to design and development. This is probably the biggest part, because if you ever look at an innovation strategy laid out like a Gantt chart, like a waterfall chart, design and development is the biggest section. And you've got your front end, you've got your design and development, manufacturing, you're setting up your QA runs all the way along, and your regulatory approval. From a time and cost perspective, design and development is the biggest effort. But as I say, build the approval into your innovation strategy. I think we covered this a little bit already. One thing from an engineering perspective is your engineering requirements, or in medtech, sometimes you call them design inputs. How those relate to risk is really important. So the whole medtech regulations are set up around risk. So dealing with risk. So when you write your requirements, you've also got to think about your risk statements, how these two interact. And if you get these two things correct, the writing requirements and writing risks is another webinar, because it gets quite complicated how the syntax and is worded to make sure you're capturing the right thing. And today's analogy is your engineering prompts in ChatGPT. You've got to frame it right. And the same with engineering requirements, as probably engineers are quite good at writing prompts because they're always writing engineering requirements and risk management. But these two things always have to match. And this begins really early when you're trying to understand your unmet clinical need. And once you've understood this starts to flow into your engineering requirements, your user needs, your marketing claims. Then that starts driving what type of verification and validation you're going to do, how you're going to manufacture it, and then pushes on down the stream to the submission. It all sorts of links together if you've got your right engineering requirements and your risk management. And those who don't know, risk management is ISO 134, no, it's not, it's 14972 for medical devices. So let's get on to the front end of innovation. So the front end of innovation is the part where you've got your unmet need, or some people call it the North Star. What you're trying to solve is the unmet clinical need. And the process, you have to start breaking that down, decomposing that into what the problems are. Typically, we use things like design thinking or ethnography, which is, if it's a surgical product, it'd be going into surgery, watching how existing products are used, the problems and the pain points those surgeons and hospital staff have to deal with, how your new product's going to solve those, interviewing people, getting key opinion leaders or lead users on your project to help you develop that design. So that's all about front end, understanding the problem. And then that starts to translate into your engineering requirements or design inputs. The key thing about engineering requirements is they have to be measurable. So that means it has to probably have an SI number. An engineering requirement that doesn't have an SI number in it is not an engineering requirement. And it has to also have a direction. So let's take an example. The shaft has to be 10 millimeters in diameter, or it has to be greater than 10 millimeters in diameter. That's your lower limit. Or the hole in this shaft is a maximum of 2 millimeters in diameter. That's an engineering requirement. I know that's very specific and solution based, but that's the sort of SI unit you have to get down to, and a direction, meaning higher, faster, stronger, greater, lesser, those sort of things, or tolerance, plus or minus. So when you're doing this, it's really important to sort of start talking about what the surgeon is, when I say surgeon, the clinician is trying to achieve, who's going to be using that device, what is the job that can be done. And the famous analogy was written back in the 90s is you don't buy a drill, you buy a hole. And this is a theory about jobs to be done, is to put up a picture on the wall. You might realize you need a screw, so you buy a drill to put a hole in. But what you're trying to achieve is the hole, so you buy the drill to build a hole. And there's lots of ways, as engineers, you can put a hole in a wall. It doesn't just have to be a drill, it can be a laser, whatever. So really got to think about, when you're trying to solve these engineering problems, is what is the job to be done, not what the solution is. Yeah, so needs, beginning of the project, you start establishing your needs, your unmet clinical need, first of all. Then then you go and do your ethnography research, you're interviewing your users, recording video of how other products in the environment are used, and that starts to create your insights around that problem. Those insights then start to evolve into user needs, and those are the actual specific list of needs that product will have to be done. And then those user needs decompose or break down even further into engineering requirements. And that all process is usually done in the front end of when you're trying to really specify the product. So make sure you've got your requirements really well written down at the beginning of the project, but also understand they will evolve as well. You will be changing requirements as you do the engineering, you learn about the product more, you go through those design iterations, but they are the constraints, they are bounding the problem. And as I said, if you write really good requirements, they automatically start writing the risks associated with them. And and then the risks and the requirements write your acceptance criteria for your testing, because your testing is testing the requirement, so it has to meet that requirement. And then that sort of goes into your clinical evaluation, the risks associated with those engineering requirements that then go into your submission, and eventually some of those will actually go into your IFUs, your labeling, and maybe your marketing materials as well. Remember that risk, when we talk about risk, it's a continuous process. So you started when you're writing requirements, but it evolves, you evaluate as the design changes, your risks change, they get updated. Hopefully you're mitigating those risks by changing the design a little bit. You're learning more about the problem, as I said here. The risk benefit improves, the state, as you learn about the state of the art, that gets better. So your risks are constantly evolving. And by the time you submit, you should have your risks lower than the benefit. So this is where the risk benefit analysis comes in, is obviously you don't, when you're designing a tongue depressor, the risk of a tongue depressor are pretty low. The benefit of a tongue depressor is pretty low as well. So, but it still has to be, the benefit has to still be higher than the risk. You can't cut your tongue. When designing a heart valve, the risks of a heart valve are incredibly high, but the benefit to that patient is even higher. And that's why you've always got to prove that the benefit, no matter how big the risks are, because there's always going to be residual risk, the benefit is bigger than those. And typically, 95% of medtech companies use FMEAs to do their risk analysis before they make the risk management report. This is a completely acceptable way to do it. I wouldn't advise you start redesigning the wheel. Go and get a standard medtech FMEA in Excel possibly, or if you've got EQMS, I'll have it in there, and start characterizing your risks using this harms and occurrence of harms and severities and all that sort of thing. And just one key, I just want to drop onto this bit, human factors and usability engineering. So that is a requirement now. Obviously, it's been a requirement for probably a good 2019, I think the latest standard came out. So that's 62366. That specifies all the things you have to do from the formative and summative studies, how you're going to validate that design and mitigate the risks that the user is going to experience. And nowadays, there's lots of companies who specialize in human factors and usability. If you don't have that in-house, I suggest you go and sort of contact a human factors specialist to help you develop that process and actually go through the testing as well. The other thing I'll just bring up is software lifecycle. So that's another key procedure, 62304, which is about software as a medical device and how that is applied when you're doing product development. And this is evolving as well. This procedure, obviously we've got AI and ML going on. So we've got software as a medical device. We've got artificial intelligence as a medical device. It's really an evolving problem at the moment, which you need to sort of keep monitoring if you do have software in your device, which could cause you problems. Start looking at what the standards are, what the conversations of the regulators is going on, because as you go through the journey, a regulation or standard could land that scuppers you a little bit, that you have to go back and do a load of work. So make sure you're listening to those conversations. You can sort of predict what if a new regulation is coming and what it might be saying, so you can start planning for it. SOUP. SOUP is a great word. Software of unknown provenance. Typically, when you're developing software, you'll have a library of software that you're picking from to augment your product. You sometimes don't know where that comes from. You don't know the revision, so you have to control for that. You have to have your software BOM in all the revisions across that BOM of all the different software from the library. So if a downstream software house updates theirs and it starts impacting yours up and changes your validation, you need to have control of that. But remember, you're writing all your requirements and you're writing all your risks, and there's a requirement to mitigate those risks as low as possible. But not all risks need tested. And this is where the art of engineering and risk management comes in, that you could spend all your time mitigating risk and trying to reduce those risks as far as possible. Every one of them, that's going to take a lot of time and a lot of money. You have to understand where the threshold is of acceptability. And back to my point about risk and benefit, when that risk drops below the benefit line, that's when you're in a good place, and then you can decide as a company how further you want to go down to reduce those risks. And it's a complicated process, and that's where risk benefit analysis comes in. And if in the EU, the CER, clinical evaluation report, all those things start to characterize those decisions. Because you cannot eliminate every risk in the device. Even if you eliminate a risk, it may generate a bunch of other risks. So you're always chasing around, and that level of risk reduction and mitigation as a company and an organization, you always have to have that open conversation to understand where you're going to stop. Right, so that was a quick run through of some of the main points of design and development. And now we're going to have a quick look at the last bit, which is market adoption side of things. So clinical investigations, first of all, as you're doing a startup and it's a new product development, you may have to do a clinical trial. You might not have a predicate device that you can base your device on. So clinical trial is important. As you're probably aware, takes a long time, costs a lot of money. Please be aware of that and start planning for it early if you think you need a clinical trial. And this is where you'll talk to a medical professional, like medical affairs or medical operations, and they will do a literature review, a state-of-the-art review, or SOTA as I like to call it, and find out if you need to do a clinical investigation. So that work needs to be done early when you're doing your requirements and understanding the problem, and you'll revisit it at the end where you start writing your clinical evaluation reports. And reimbursement. So I think in medical devices, a lot of times people didn't really consider reimbursement, but over the last decade, reimbursement is really important. The coding in the US coding. So your device has to fit within the code. And if your device doesn't fit with an existing code, you have to go through a very long process of getting a new code created, which I've heard is extremely difficult. I've never done it myself, but I've heard it's extremely difficult. So you have to go through that coding process. And even if you've got a code from the US government, because that's for Medicaid and Medicare, the hospitals might not accept your device either. So you have to go through another process of each of the hospitals, like Kaiser Permanente or someone like that, United Health, and get your product on their books as well. So really complicated in the US. If you do need a new code, you need to start planning for it. You need to find experts who know the coding process in the US. In the UK, not quite similar to the US, because in the UK we have healthcare, but it has its complications as well. You've heard of the NHS National Health Service, but here each region has its own trust, its own mini NHS of 4 or 5 different hospitals, and you have to sell your product to each one. So showing the value of that device is really important for the uptake. So though you might not have to do a clinical trial to prove the safety and efficacy of the device, you might have to do a clinical trial to show the value over existing solutions, which is a different problem to solve. And another one of showing that value is something called health economics, or shortened for HEMA, health economics and market access. And these people, health economic specialists, work out the value and benefit that this device may bring to the users. So is it reduced hospital stays, reduced overall cost? Who's benefiting from it? Who is experiencing all the risks of this device? They will work out that whole process, and it's quite a standard process. A lot of data they will gather to work out the health economics, and then provide the startup or the entrepreneur with the gaps of where they need to go and do a clinical trial, that sort of thing. Obviously, health economics and reimbursement is happens at the commercial side of the process. But to get to that point, have that data, you need to start it before you've even started your design work, because it's all about the state of the art, what's happening now. And you're familiar patents have state of the art as well. This health economics is what is the standard of care now? What's the outcomes? Where do we think the new product will improve those outcomes? And establishing even what the outcomes are is really important. I think that was one of my last slides. So really, the key takeaway here is think about what you're trying to get approval for, how you're going to try and get that approval, and keep stepping back when you're designing your innovation process through that. So how are we going to access, how are we going to get approval, who's going to buy and adopt it, what QMS process, and what's the requirements and risks associated with that device. Once you have that, you can start running as quickly as you can. And I heard a great analogy is from an expert project manager is plan slowly, execute fast. So really think about how you're going to do it. In planning a medtech project takes 2 or 3 months roughly. And you're going to spend millions and millions and millions on this device. So 2 or 3 months is nothing, just to sit down and really consider the problem. I tell the startups I work for is, depending on the complexity, developing a medical device may take 3 to 5 years. Each year will cost about $1 million. So if it's a 3-year project, you're looking at about 3 million, 5 million for a 5 million point on average. You'll spend a little bit at the start, and you'll spend a lot when you go for your manufacturing and your process validations at the end. But on average, you're spending about $1 million a year in that. And you might say, well, I'm doing a simple thing. So a simple thing might only take 18 months to design, develop, and get approval for. So it only costs 1.5 million to develop. That sort of thing. If you like, also, you can go onto my website. Here's a QR code, and there's a white paper you can download that takes you from some of the hidden pitfalls of market approval, a bit more detail of what I've been talking today. And that's me. Thank you. I think, Eric, we've got questions now.
Yes, thank you. That's a very informative presentation. Appreciate that. And thank you for leaving up your QR code. So the first question I have is risk assessment. To use your example of a tongue depressor, if you get a splinter in your tongue, it's not a big deal. But if you're making a heart pacemaker and it fails, then there's the risk of medical malpractice and things like that. Should you consult legal advice on that? To be how encompassing does that risk assessment need to be?
So not legal, not necessarily legal advice, but clinical advice. So a clinician um, will help you understand the clinical benefit of the device. And a lot of hospitals and company and organizations have clinical specialists will help characterize what the risks are. So yeah, if you're making a tongue depressor and it cuts your tongue or gives you a splinter, it's probably not a great design, is it?
Well, unless I gets infected somehow, but we won't go
Yeah.
there. One of the things that caught my attention, you talked about the upcoming harmonization of the QMSR to ISO 13485. What should companies be doing now to expedite that harmonization, since the clock is literally ticking on that?
Yeah. So if you've not already got 13485 compliance, you don't have to have ISO 13485 compliance. They're not harmonizing. They're still going to have the QSR 820, but it's going to be rewritten into ISO 13485 language, to put it like that. So you're still okay. But if you come to Europe or any other countries that accept 13485, you'll have to go and find a auditor, like a notified body, to give you your ISO 13485 certification
All right.
as a medical device company.
All right. Thank you. Question from Matthew. Can you expand more on when formal design control efforts should start during early prototyping? Big changes happen all the time. Formal design controls would really slow this process down. Should it be closer to a design freeze?
Okay. Always a popular question. Um, and remember, I come from engineering design, so I'm a not don't st- I'm on the camp don't start it too early, exactly for those reasons, right? Wait until you've got a stable design, not a design freeze, but a stable design. You know, like stable design or proof of concept, right? You know what it's going to do. Then you can start even just recording your requirements and your risks. You don't have to put it in a QMS yet, right? You just have to start understanding the problem. And at some point, yeah, you have to start your design control processes. But my opinion is similar to what I think Matthew's trying to suggest here is don't start them too early because you might be wasting your time and effort to start design control too early. But I sort of predicted this question actually because I've always had problems why the FDA and particularly the FDA state how, if you look at the FDA guidance on product development, right, they state a waterfall chart. And I was thinking, like, why do they care how we're developing it? Surely the end product and all the documentation you've put around it shows it safe, has to show it's safe and efficacious. If we've spent 20 years and $20 million and developed 15,000 prototypes that have all gone in the bin, which Dyson did, by the way. It created 15,000 prototypes. Go, recording every one of those prototypes is a waste of time. You only have to really think about the last one and making sure that's recorded properly. Long-winded answer, but I'm on delay as much as you can before you have to say, okay, we probably start going to design code. And you can sort of feel it now. When you start doing that detail engineering part is when you're doing design control.
All right. I don't know if you've answered this earlier, but the question from Dom is when and who selects the fluids used in the manufacturing process for internal medical development compliance?
Ooh, good one. So, so the consumables I think you're asking about is like the lubricants when you're doing machining.
Right.
Um, this is now captured in biocompatibility stat 62366, is it? I can't remember, 60601 or maybe. So the biocompatibility standard requires the medical device manufacturer to specify not just the materials used in construction, so the product materials, but also the production materials as well. So any lubricants that are used in the machining or any silicon sprays you may have used in injection molding, all those have to be specified and controlled by the manufacturing facility now, because they've had problems with infection because of the wrong materials, wrong consumables being used, and it remained on the product. So it's not just the consumables, but it's how it's cleaned to remove all those consumables. All has to be controlled and monitored. Who selects it? It's well, so manufacturing, a medical device manufacturer will have be audited, and they like to ISO 13485, for instance, and the manufacturer should have control of what consumables they're using, and approved as a medical device manufacturing consumable. Does that answer your question, Dom?
Okay. So you talk about the notified bodies, and they are independent auditors. Are they all held to a certain standard, or are some more equal than others, so to speak?
Oh, does anyone have a notified body on the call? So they are audited by the EU, so they're also audited to the next level up. So the EU gives them a certificate to be a notified body. It allows them to audit organizations. Like any range of companies, there's the good, the bad, and the ugly when it comes to these things. And that's why I say you've got to interview them and be quite vociferous in your interviewing and ask for documents and proof. The cheapest is not always the best, as we know in life. And also the biggest may not be the best either.
Okay. Matthew asks again, I hear fail fast and fail forward all the time in the startup world. What does this look like in medical devices when you can't test something without spending millions of dollars or pounds or euros?
Yeah. So first of all, there's a point after that comment that everyone misses. It's fail fast, but learn something, right? If you're just failing, it's no point. You've got to learn something from it. Yes, you can't take anything to market without actually going through the entire development process. That's even doing a clinical trial, right? It is, and obviously we are developing products to be used on humans. So it's a different philosophy of that fail fast. And the only way also the other problem related to the lean startup, Eric Ries's book, where all this comes from, is the minimum viable product. And I've always struggled in medical devices what the minimum viable product would be. It should be the best you can make it for the time and the cost you've got, right? Not the lowest level of product, because it's ultimately going to be used in a patient. But to answer your question, Matthew, it's a difficult one, but you can't fail fast when you've developed a medical device. You've got to develop the best you can. You can fail fast by experimenting, so developing a prototype, testing it on cadavers if it's a surgical device, or asking users to play with it, but not actually doing any diagnosis of the product or anything like that. You can fail that way, but that's typical product development innovation and design iterations. But yeah, it's a tricky one. And that whole fail fast and go through lots of iterations is a tricky one to apply to medical devices. Same with aeroplanes. You can't really fail fast and do a minimum viable aeroplane either. I wouldn't want to fly on it.
All right. Well, I see we're just about out of time. So thank you, Stuart. Thank you also to our series sponsor, Kennametal. Please be sure to register for our upcoming free webinars by clicking on the hamburger menu tab of our websites. Those are the 3 horizontal lines on the header bar. And on the drop-down menu, click the event link about 5 down from the top. If you have any comments or suggestions, please email them to me at ebrothers@gie.net. On behalf of GIE Media's Manufacturing Group Publications, I wish you a good day and goodbye for now.
You can listen to all of our episodes of Manufacturing Matters and Lunch and Learn podcast from the MFG Radio Network on Spotify, Apple Music, and on our websites, todaysmedicaldevelopments.com, aerospacemanufacturinganddesign.com, defenseandmunitions.com, and evdesignandmanufacturing.com.